Hi, this is a summary of Joseph Butler's sermon number 12 entitled Upon the Love of Our Neighbor. And it begins with the same Bible verse that started sermon number 11. These two are connected. The Bible verse is Romans 13, verse 9. It says, "And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." In the first paragraph, he describes the four parts of the sermon. He says, quote, he's going to examine who is our neighbor, in what sense are we required to love him as ourselves, the influence such love would have upon our behavior in life, and lastly, how this commandment comprehends in it all others. So to begin with the first point, in paragraph number 2, he's going to explore who is our neighbor. And he says that the neighbor God has this love for all of us, for actually the whole world. But since we aren't like God in that sense, we're not as great as God, we don't have the capacity to love the whole universe, the scope of our love must be smaller. And so he narrows the scope to first consider all other humans, all other humans in our region, and then finally our neighbor, which is the term used in the verse. He says the definition here of neighbor must be just, quote, just that part of the universe, that part of mankind, that part of our country which comes under our immediate notice, acquaintance, and influence, and with which we have to do, end quote. That's paragraph number 3. So it's the love of our neighbor, those who are in our realm of influence. Second, he's now going to consider, he says in paragraph number 5, the sense we are commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves. So first he describes this as an affection. Just as we love ourselves, we have a feeling of love for ourselves, then we ought to also have a love for others. This feeling will enable us to live in, as he describes it, peace, plenty, freedom, and healthful seasons with others. And he says that we have the golden rule that we have an obligation to fulfill. If we have the feeling or the affection that goes along with it, we are more likely to fulfill our obligations to the golden rule, our obligation to others. Secondly, in paragraph number 9, he thinks that our love for our neighbor needs to be in proportion to other loves, and that will determine whether or not we are actually loving our neighbors. So it's got to be proportionate to other internal principles, not necessarily to other people. So he says it's wrong to compare, to decide whether somebody's benevolent in terms of, or virtuous, by comparing them with other people who may be less virtuous or benevolent. It's better to compare the principle, the affection in one's own person relative to other principle in that person, so that the proportion of benevolence to self-love is what determines whether a person is actually benevolent or not. And just because somebody is more benevolent to another person, it may still be the case that that same person's self-love may be higher in that one person than their own benevolence, meaning that they aren't much of a benevolent person. Okay, moving on to, this is section number 15. He says that, imagine the case where you've got an equality of benevolence and self-love, meaning those two feelings are equal in the same person. The concern is, well, would that mean that self-love would be neglected? And for him, that's an objection he wants to consider. He thinks that no, this would not in fact happen, because even if those two affections were equal in one person, there are other particular affections that are unique to each individual that would push the considerations over the line for the person. In other words, the self would not be neglected in any of these situations. Benevolence is not going to violate one's own self-love. Moving on to section 20, this is the third part of the sermon. He says he's going to examine the temper of love and its influence on our actions. And so by temper, he means here that those affections or the emotional sides of our character. He examines the passage from 1 Corinthians 13, which is the famous love passage, and he says that if we were to cultivate this type of affection or this temper in our lives, this would make us more caring. It would also make us better friends and better neighbors and better citizens. He says that this would allow us to avoid infighting and dissensions, and he calls it party, or I think he means partisanship, and we would also avoid retaliation. In the final part of his sermon, he examines what it means for the love of our neighbors to include all the other virtues, to have priority. And he says that even the virtues of temperance, sobriety, and moderation, this is paragraph number 30 now, that these things are included in benevolence. In other words, to be benevolent means to avoid the excesses of certain pleasures, which can cause and bring harm on other people. He also says that if we were to look at the virtuous person to try to identify the virtuous people in our society, we would identify them as those who are more benevolent than not, those who have more benevolence than anything else. It's even piety. Even if we were to look at religion, the religiously pious, those people are pious who are benevolent. So piety is connected to benevolence. Okay, I hope that's helpful.